German soldiers, battle-hardened warriors who'd conquered half of Europe, suddenly freezing in absolute terror. Not from bullets, not from bombs, but from a sound, a mechanical growl that turned their blood to ice. They called it the Devil's Paintbrush. British troops nicknamed it the Bitch. Military historians labeled it the ugliest weapon ever created. Yet this bizarre contraption changed warfare forever, saving thousands of Allied lives while haunting German nightmares for generations. What made this weapon so terrifying that grown men would rather face artillery fire than hear its distinctive roar? The year was 1914. Europe had plunged into darkness. The Great War, what we now call World War I, had begun, and everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of quick victories and glorious charges, soldiers found themselves trapped in a nightmare nobody had anticipated: trench warfare. Imagine standing in a muddy ditch, sometimes waist-deep in freezing water, surrounded by rats the size of cats, with the constant smell of death in your nostrils. Barbed wire stretched across no man's land like metallic spider webs. Machine guns nested in concrete bunkers, creating killing fields where advancing meant certain death. Hundreds of thousands of young men died, trying to gain just a few yards of blood-soaked earth. The British Army faced a horrifying problem. Every time they ordered an attack, brave soldiers climbed out of their trenches and ran straight into German machine gun fire. The Maxim guns, German heavy machine guns, could fire 600 rounds per minute. Men fell like wheat before a scythe. Officers watched helplessly as entire battalions were massacred within minutes, their bodies piling up on the barbed wire, creating grotesque monuments to military futility. Traditional tactics had become suicide missions. Cavalry charges? Useless against machine guns. Artillery bombardments? The Germans simply hid in their deep bunkers, then emerged when the shelling stopped to mow down attacking infantry. Something revolutionary was needed, something that could move across no man's land, crush barbed wire, survive machine gun fire, and protect advancing troops. British military minds worked frantically. They experimented with armored cars, but wheels got stuck in mud. They tried shields on wheels, but soldiers pushing them were still exposed. The problem seemed unsolvable. Meanwhile, the death toll climbed higher every single day. Young men wrote final letters home before going over the top, knowing they'd probably never see another sunrise. Then someone had an audacious idea. What if they created a moving fortress? A steel beast that could crawl across trenches, smash through obstacles, and bring terror to the enemy? The concept seemed insane, impossible even, but desperate times demanded desperate innovation. In secret workshops, far from the front lines, British engineers began creating something the world had never seen before. They worked day and night, knowing that every hour wasted meant more lives lost in the trenches. The weapon they created looked absolutely ridiculous. Military officials laughed when they first saw it. Even the British soldiers weren't sure whether to be inspired or embarrassed. But the Germans? They wouldn't be laughing for long. Are you still watching? Drop a comment telling us which country you're from. Let's see our global community. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold military stories. September 15th, 1916. The Battle of the Somme had been raging for over 2 months. British casualties had already exceeded 400,000 men, an almost incomprehensible number. The optimism of 1914 had long since drowned in mud and blood. Soldiers no longer believed in glory or quick victories. They believed in survival, one miserable day at a time. That morning, as dawn broke over the scarred landscape of France, German sentries peered through the pre-dawn gloom from their trenches near Flers-Courcelette. They'd seen it all by now: artillery barges, poison gas attacks, wave after wave of British infantry. They felt confident in their defensive positions, their machine guns ready, their nerves as steady as nerves could be after 2 years of industrial-scale slaughter. Then they heard something that didn't make sense. A mechanical rumbling. Deep, guttural, like nothing in nature. At first, they thought it was trucks or tractors, perhaps bringing supplies to British lines. But the sound grew louder, more menacing. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. Some soldiers grabbed their binoculars, straining to see through the morning mist. What emerged from that fog would haunt them forever. Massive metal beasts, shaped like giant rhomboids, crawled toward them. These things moved on caterpillar tracks that churned through mud that would swallow a horse. Bullets pinged harmlessly off their armored hides. Barbed wire, the defender's best friend, simply flattened beneath them like grass. And mounted on these mechanical monsters were guns that swiveled, searching for targets. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Their training, their experience, their courage, none of it had prepared them for this moment. These weren't weapons. They were nightmares made real, steel demons that couldn't be stopped by conventional means. The sound alone was psychologically devastating. A mechanical roar mixed with the clanking of tracks, the whine of engines, and the rattle of machine guns. Some German soldiers stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were telling them. Others broke and ran, abandoning positions they'd held for months. A few brave souls tried to fight back, firing rifles at these approaching behemoths, but their bullets had no more effect than raindrops on a castle wall. The British WWII tank had arrived on the battlefield, and warfare would never be the same again. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The tank's effectiveness wasn't really about its armor or its guns. It was about something far more primal, pure, visceral psychological terror. Let me explain what the Germans actually saw that morning. The WWII tank was, objectively speaking, an absolutely ridiculous machine. It looked like someone had welded a massive metal box onto agricultural tracks and hoped for the best. British soldiers themselves called it the bitch because of how temperamental and difficult it was to operate. The thing broke down constantly. Its top speed was barely 4 miles per hour. You could literally walk faster. Inside, the crew of 8 men worked in conditions that can only be described as hellish. Imagine being locked inside a giant steel coffin. The temperature could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Engine fumes filled the cabin, making men vomit and pass out. The noise was so deafening that crew members communicated by tapping each other on the shoulder or using hand signals. Every time a bullet hit the exterior, and thousands did, the impact created metal splinters that flew around the interior like shrapnel, causing horrific facial injuries. Crews took to wearing chainmail masks, making them look like medieval knights riding steel dragons. The tank's guns weren't particularly impressive either. Some models carried 2 6-pounder cannons, others just machine guns. You could find more firepower in a standard infantry unit. The vision slits were so narrow that drivers could barely see where they were going. Tanks regularly got stuck in ditches, crashed into trees, or simply broke down in the middle of no man's land, becoming stationary coffins for their crews. So why did German soldiers panic? Why did hardened veterans, men who'd survived years of the worst fighting humanity had ever seen, break and run from these slow, cumbersome, frequently breaking down machines? The answer lies in human psychology. The Germans had adapted to every weapon thrown at them. Machine guns? Terrifying, but you could hide from them. Artillery? Devastating, but predictable patterns. Poison gas? Horrible, but gas masks offered protection. Human enemies? No matter how skilled or brave, they were still human. They bled. They died. They could be stopped. But tanks? Tanks were different. They represented something alien, something that violated the fundamental rules of warfare as everyone understood them. Cover meant nothing. Tanks drove over trenches. Barbed wire meant nothing. Tanks crushed it. Machine gun fire meant nothing. Bullets bounced off. The basic survival instincts that soldiers relied on simply didn't apply. More than that, the tank's very appearance was unsettling. Military equipment is usually designed with some thought to aesthetics. Rifles look sleek, Artillery pieces have a certain brutal elegance. Even battleships have graceful lines. The Mark I tank looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never seen a vehicle before and was working from a fever dream description. Its rhomboid shape made no visual sense. Tracks wrapped completely around the hull, making it look like some prehistoric arthropod. The sponsons, armored boxes on the sides that held the guns, stuck out like bizarre growths. And the whole thing moved with an unnatural, lurching gait that seemed more organic than mechanical, like a wounded animal dragging itself across the battlefield. German soldiers later described feeling a primal, instinctive revulsion. One veteran wrote, "It was like watching a house learn to walk." Another said, "We shot at it again and again, but it kept coming. Nothing stopped it." In that moment, I understood what helplessness truly meant. The British had accidentally created the perfect psychological weapon. The tank's very inefficiency contributed to its terror. Because it moved so slowly, defenders had to watch it approach for agonizing minutes, knowing their weapons were useless, feeling their courage drain away with every second. Because it was so loud, it announced its presence long before it arrived, giving imaginations time to run wild. Because it looked so strange, it triggered deep evolutionary responses to unknown predators. There's a reason humans fear the uncanny. Things that are almost familiar, but fundamentally wrong. Tanks hit that psychological sweet spot perfectly. They were vehicles, but moved like animals. They were machines, but seemed almost alive. They were weapons, but unlike any weapon that had ever existed. And the British, whether by genius or accident, had given them the perfect cover name during development. To maintain secrecy, they told factory workers they were building water carriers for Mesopotamia. They called them tanks because they supposedly looked like water tanks. The name stuck, but in those early battles, German soldiers had different names: Teufelsmaschinen, devil machines, Hollenhund, hellhounds, and most tellingly, Schrecklichkeit, the frightfulness. The mystery wasn't how the tank worked mechanically. The mystery was how something so flawed, so unreliable, so objectively ridiculous could become so psychologically devastating. But wait, there's something more here. Something the history books often gloss over. Because while that first tank attack at Flers-Courcelette succeeded brilliantly, it also revealed something disturbing about the weapon's true nature. Of the 49 tanks that were supposed to participate in that first attack, only 32 made it to the starting line. The rest broke down before even reaching the battlefield. Of those 32, only 21 made it into actual combat. The others got stuck, suffered mechanical failures, or simply couldn't navigate the terrain. Of those 21, several were knocked out by German artillery once the initial shock wore off. So here's the suspicious part. The British High Command knew all this. They knew the tanks were unreliable. They knew most wouldn't make it to combat. They knew the ones that did make it would likely break down within hours. Yet they committed to using them anyway. Why? The truth is darker than you might think. British commanders had begun to realize something troubling about modern warfare. Actual military effectiveness mattered less than the appearance of effectiveness. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, traumatized, hanging on by psychological threads. The war had become as much about breaking enemy morale as actually defeating enemy armies. The tank wasn't really designed to be a super weapon. It was designed to be a terror weapon. British planners had studied the psychological impact of every previous innovation: machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, and noticed a pattern. The initial deployment created panic and chaos far beyond the weapon's actual destructive capability. Once enemies adapted and understood the weapon, its psychological impact diminished dramatically. So they kept the tanks secret for as long as possible. They built them in hidden facilities. They moved them at night, covered by tarps. They created elaborate deception plans. All of this wasn't really about military surprise. It was about maximizing that first psychological impact, that moment when German soldiers would see something their minds couldn't process and break. and it worked. But it also revealed something uncomfortable about how military leadership was thinking. Soldiers, their own soldiers, were dying in those hellish tanks. The crew survival rate was abysmal. Men cooked alive when tanks caught fire. They suffocated from engine fumes. They were torn apart by metal splinters. They got trapped when tanks flipped into craters, drowning in mud. The British High Command knew this. They'd seen the casualty reports from training accidents alone. Yet they pushed ahead because the psychological impact on the enemy outweighed the lives of their own tank crews. In the cold calculus of industrial warfare, 8 men dying in a tank was acceptable if it prevented 200 men dying in a frontal assault. Was this brilliant military strategy or cold-blooded cynicism? The answer probably depends on whether you were a general reading reports in a comfortable headquarters or a 19-year-old tank driver breathing toxic fumes in a steel coffin at 120 degrees while bullets rang against your armor like deadly rain. November 20th, 1917. The Battle of Cambrai. This was the moment when the tank's true potential and its terrible cost became fully apparent. The British had learned from their mistakes. Instead of using tanks in small numbers, they assembled 476 of them. Instead of spreading them out, they concentrated them for a massive punch. Instead of attacking after artillery bombardments that churned the ground into impassable mud, they attacked on firm ground, hoping for speed and surprise. At 6:20 a.m., in darkness, the attack began. The thunder of nearly 500 tanks moving together created a sound German defenders described as the end of the world. The ground shook. The air itself seemed to vibrate. And then, as dawn broke, the Germans saw them. A wall of steel monsters stretching across the entire front, all moving forward in a slow, unstoppable wave. The result was the most successful British attack of the entire war up to that point. The Germans broke, not slowly, not in organized retreat, but in complete panic. Soldiers abandoned positions they'd held for 3 years. Machine gunners fled their weapons. Officers lost control of their units. The British advanced 6 miles in 6 hours, gains that would have taken months and cost hundreds of thousands of lives in previous battles. Church bells rang in London for the first time since the war began. Newspapers proclaimed the beginning of the end. The tank had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a war-winning weapon. But then reality reasserted itself. Within days, the mechanical breakdowns became catastrophic. Of those 476 tanks, fewer than 50 were still operational after the first day. The Germans, after recovering from their initial shock, developed countertactics. They learned that tanks were vulnerable to artillery fire. They created specialized anti-tank weapons. Most devastatingly, they realized that tanks without infantry support were just slow-moving targets. The British advance stalled. The Germans counterattacked. Within 2 weeks, they'd retaken almost all the lost ground. The British ended up with only slightly more territory than they'd started with, but at enormous cost. 45,000 British casualties, including hundreds of tank crews. The climax of the tank's story isn't about triumph. It's about the moment when everyone realized that even revolutionary weapons can't change the fundamental brutality of war. The tank could create shock and terror, yes. It could break through supposedly impenetrable defenses, but it couldn't win the war by itself. It was still a tool used by frightened young men, opposed by other frightened young men, all of them caught in a conflict that ground up human beings with industrial efficiency. The ugliest British weapon had proven it could make German soldiers panic. But it had also proven something else, that in modern war, there are no miracle weapons, only different ways to send young men to their deaths. The tank didn't end the horror of World War I. It just industrialized it further. The Mark I tank's legacy extended far beyond World War I battlefields, reshaping society in ways its creators never imagined. This ugly, ungainly machine fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with warfare, technology, and power itself. Militarily, the tank revolutionized strategy. The centuries-old dominance of defensive positions ended. Castles, fortresses, trenches, all became obsolete overnight. By World War II, tank warfare had evolved into blitzkrieg, where armored columns moving at speed could conquer entire nations in weeks. The psychological terror of that first mark I had evolved into the thundering tank armies that rolled across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But the impact went deeper than military tactics. The tank represented something profound about the 20th century, the marriage of industrial technology and organized violence. Before World War I, warfare still retained elements of individual heroism, skill, and courage. A skilled rifleman could matter. A brave cavalry charge could turn battles. The tank changed this calculus completely. Now wars would be won by whoever could produce more machines, faster and better. Nations became giant factories, churning out weapons on assembly lines. This industrialization of warfare changed society itself. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, building the tanks men would die in. Economic mobilization became total. Every resource, every person, every aspect of national life bent toward military production. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, then disappeared. If you worked in a tank factory, you were part of the war machine, making you a legitimate military target in the eyes of enemies. Strategic bombing of cities became not just acceptable, but standard practice. Psychologically, the tank changed how humans viewed conflict. Medieval knights could see their enemies' faces. Riflemen aimed at individual soldiers. But tank crews operated machines that crushed trenches full of men they never saw, killed enemies who were reduced to targets, statistics, acceptable losses. This psychological distance made industrial-scale killing possible. The Holocaust, the atomic bombs, the firebombing of cities, all became thinkable once we accepted that human beings could be reduced to numbers processed by machines. The tank also represented a darker truth, that ugly, imperfect, barely functional technology could still change the world. The mark I was ridiculous, everyone admitted it. But it worked well enough. This good enough philosophy would define modern military thinking. Don't wait for perfection. Deploy what works right now, learn from failures, iterate quickly. The tech industry's move fast and break things mentality has its roots in those muddy French fields where broken-down tanks still manage to terrify an enemy into retreat. Most significantly, the tank proved that terror is a weapon as powerful as any gun. Those German soldiers didn't panic because tanks were killing them efficiently. They panicked because tanks violated their understanding of reality. The Mark I tank was ugly, unreliable, and terrifying, much like war itself. It wasn't elegant engineering that made German soldiers panic. It was the primal fear of facing something alien, unstoppable, and incomprehensible. That rusted metal beast changed warfare forever, not through superior firepower, but through pure psychological devastation. Today, those early tanks sit in museums, silent reminders of humanity's capacity for both innovation and horror. They teach us that the most powerful weapons aren't always the deadliest. Sometimes they are simply the most terrifying. What's your take on psychological warfare? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this untold story captivated you, hit that subscribe button. History's darkest secrets await. Share this with someone who needs to know the truth.